Hello, everyone. We're going to just give folks about another minute or two to join. We see a bunch of folks joining right now, so we'll get started here in just a second. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the Sweetwater Lake public meeting. We're going to be talking about a handful of things around this project tonight. I'm going to turn it over first to our interpretation service to speak a little bit about the interpretation offerings for tonight, and then we will do our official welcome. So Ruth, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Muchas gracias. Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos, todas, todes. Hello, everybody. Mi nombre es Ruth. Estoy aquí con el COC y el día de hoy estamos proporcionando servicios de interpretación al español para cualquier persona que guste escucharlo en español. Entonces, cuando enciendan el globo terráqueo en la parte baja de su pantalla, ahí van a poder elegir su canal. Si prefieren escucharlo en español, pueden elegir español. Si está en un celular o una tableta, también va a tener la opción bajo los 3 puntitos que dice More o más de elegir su canal. Si tiene alguna pregunta o duda, déjenme saber. Voy a estar disponible en la cajita del chat. Si está participando el día de hoy, solo quiero recordarles de hablar a un ritmo cómodo para poder darle seguimiento a todo lo que se dice. Y ahora voy a repetir esto en inglés. So once again, thank you so much. My name is Ruth and I'm here with the COC. We are providing interpretation services today. If you would like to select Spanish as your main option, once we turn it on, you will see a globe icon come up. You can go on there and select the language that you prefer to listen to. If you're monolingual in Spanish, you can select Spanish. If you have any problems or questions, let me know. I will be available in the chat box. And if you are speaking today, I would like to just remind you to speak at a conversational pace, just to make sure that I have enough time to interpret everything that is being said. And once again, thank you. We can turn it on.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Beatty. I work for a firm called CDR Associates, and we are facilitating this meeting this evening. I know that we have a number of Parks and Wildlife commissioners on the call, and appreciate each of you joining. I would welcome our Parks and Wildlife Commission Chair, Carrie Hauser. If you'd like to say any words to open the meeting, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for everyone who has organized us tonight. And glad to hear that there are a couple of other commissioners on. We are not deliberating this just because for open meetings rules. I'm just really here to say welcome. Thank you for everyone who's participating and dialing in tonight. I live locally. I am the CPW commissioner who lives in Garfield County. So I definitely on a personal level care about this conversation and was pleased to see that this opportunity for public input would be available. Mostly I assume that I share this with any other CPW commissioners that might be listening in, are really here to listen. We're here to understand, anything that the public and others that might have an interest in Sweetwater Lake. We just like to hear from you. And we have toured the site. We did that last summer, so we're familiar with it, obviously, and we're in a position where we're waiting to see what sort of all the deliberations and these kinds of conversations bring back to us. We obviously prioritize and appreciate partnerships and are certainly looking to that when this comes back to the Parks and Wildlife Commission. The partnerships with the Forest Service, CPW, obviously, the Eagle Valley Land Trust, Garfield and Eagle counties, the Sweetwater Lake community. Everyone really needs to be at the table on this. And I think what we hope to see at the end of the line is an opportunity to really preserve this beautiful place that you can see in the photographs, to expand access to it. That has been challenging for a lot of the public, and to certainly preserve it as well. That's certainly one of the things that CPW, it's in our mission. And the CPW staff that are on certainly know that it takes a lot to manage these really fragile places. So whether that's sort of the human history, the ecological fragile environment, those are all the things that we want to see captured in a future plan for CPW to help partner and manage this. And I would say we really want to make sure that everyone, all the key stakeholders are involved in this, and that it is a very broad-based public input process. So thank you very much for being here. I'm actually going to go off screen and just listen tonight and look forward to the conversation. So I'll turn it back to, I think, Melissa probably. So thanks for including the commission and certainly me tonight. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chair Hauser. I really appreciate it. So I do want to give a quick welcome to everyone. In addition to the words that Chair Hauser shared, you'll see a handful of folks, panelists on the screen. We're going to hear from a couple panelists during the presentation. The other folks are on for the Q&A portion. So when we get to the Q&A portion, we want to make sure that we've got a handful of representation from the Forest Service, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and Eagle Valley Land Trust to be part of the discussion during the Q&A. So many folks you'll see will have their cameras off, their mics off, but will be part of the Q&A portion. For folks who do have questions as they come up, we encourage you to type those into the chat to let us know what your questions are. We'll capture those. We won't answer those right away. We'll capture those for the end so that we'll have a great discussion towards the end about the questions that you all have. And then at the very end, we'll be opening our public survey. So we'll be sharing links to that where we'll continue to get some of this really important public input. So with that, what are we going to hear about today? So this evening, we're going to hear, of course, we had our welcome. We'll do a quick agenda review. We'll have some folks talk about the project. So what's the history of this project? Where has this project come from? And where is this project going? Some specifics around the timeline, for example. We'll also talk about some of the ongoing data collection, recreation use, and concept designs. And we'll finalize the presentation portion talking about public engagement. So what public engagement has happened so far, and then what can you expect as far as next steps go of how each of you can be engaged in the process. And we'll end, probably we'll have about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more, depending on the presentation length for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. We'll start with Leanne from the Forest Service, then go to Mark with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and then end with Bergen from Eagle Valley Land Trust. So if you all want to introduce yourselves really quickly, and then we'll get the presentation started.
Great. Can you hear me okay? I think. Okay. I'm Leanne Veldhuis with the Forest Service. I'm the district ranger for Eagle Holy Cross Ranger District, which is the area of the White River National Forest that has Sweetwater Lake. Over to you, Mark.
Mark Lehman with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I was hired to manage the Sweetwater property for CPW once we get to that point.
My name is Bergen Josem. I'm the deputy director over at the Eagle Valley Land Trust. We're a local conservation nonprofit in Eagle County, and we helped launch the Save the Lake campaign that led to the public acquisition of the property.
Great. Thank you all. And Leanne, we'll turn it over to you to talk about the project and just let me know when to move on with the slides.
Okay, great. Yep, let's go to the next one. So I acknowledge many folks on the call are very familiar with Sweetwater, and others maybe not so much. So I'll take us through a history of the site to where we are today. Starting off, Sweetwater Lake and the surrounding area has thousands of years of significant tribal history for the Ute Native Americans, and well into today has significant cultural values that we will be working with the tribes on next steps for protecting and ensuring that those tribal resources are considered with the appropriate management. Fast forward, kind of in more recent history, various kind of well-known individuals that can call some ties to Sweetwater. Famed Denver Post artist Paul Gregg, and gangster, mobster, bootlegger, racketeer Diamond Jack even called Sweetwater home in the 1920s and 30s. For the last several decades, Sweetwater Lake has primarily been privately owned. So there's Sweetwater Lake and Ranch. There's a restaurant, cabins, various private infrastructure on site that has been there and utilized for many, many years. During its private ownership, the White River National Forest has had a campground on the southeastern shore. So that section was public land. And the area in general has a long history of being used for horseback riding, hiking, fishing, outfitting, those types of services and uses. So then roughly 4 or 5 years ago, being under private ownership, there's always kind of generally been development pressure around, and one came up in a big way of there's a possibility that Sweetwater Lake was going to be developed into, few hundred homes, a golf course, water bottling facility, and not be what it has always been. And so, as Bergen mentioned, the Save the Lake campaign was launched. The Conservation Fund purchased Sweetwater Lake and held it in ownership, and then approached the U.S. Forest Service. So let's go to the next slide. And so basically, due to just the significant values of the site, it's the 3rd largest natural lake in Colorado. It has amazing birds and wildlife, raptor species. It's winter range habitat for elk, high quality wetlands. As I mentioned before, with notable kind of archaeological and Ute cultural importance. There's geologic features on site, its proximity to the Flat Tops Wilderness, and a variety of really outstanding, the surrounding area has outstanding non-motorized recreational opportunities. All of these were major drivers when, in addition to the Save the Lake campaign, that when the Conservation Fund and the community, et cetera, approached the Forest Service with the possibility of the Forest Service purchasing the site to become public land, it ranked very highly, and roughly $8 to $9 million from this Land and Water Conservation Fund was used to purchase the property from the Conservation Fund in August 2021, and it became public land, National Forest land. Next slide, please. So when that happened, and all throughout that process, the Forest Service received many letters of support for the acquisition from the community, CPW, EVLT, lots of partners that, I'm sorry, I don't have time to list off today, but basically, once it became public ownership, the Forest Service realized, okay, wow, we've just acquired roughly 500 acres of this outstanding site. It's public land now. The public's going to come. We don't have the staffing, the funding, et cetera, to manage the site in a way to conserve, to protect it, and make sure that the values that we acquired it for remain. And so then kind of generally around that time, just the conversations take place of who can we reach out to help us. We commonly will partner in sort of these complex recreation areas all over the forest, all over the country, to help the Forest Service in managing areas like this. So the conversations with Colorado Parks and Wildlife continued into reaching out to them for the possibility of partnering and doing a first of its kind, we like to say, partnership with the Forest Service to manage the Sweetwater area with CPW at the site. Next slide, please. And so when that partnership formed between the Forest Service, CPW, and Eagle Valley Land Trust, you know, we identified several goals that we wanted to kind of make sure that we're hitting on. As has been mentioned, and a lot of these tie to the reasons that the Forest Service was able to acquire the land. You know, improving access, modernizing the facilities, many of which on site hadn't seen maintenance or upkeep for many years under the private ownership. Generally provide updated and sustainable recreation services that fit with the site, are appropriate to the environment around there, and are desired by the public, which is part of this process that we're in now. Retain and protect the natural and social characteristics of the area that I mentioned earlier, the wildlife, wetland, cave, and other resources, and then really getting at that public input for the site while acknowledging that historical legacy of the place during our process. Next slide, please. So I left us off with kind of the Save the Lake campaign, Conservation Fund purchasing the site, and then the White River National Forest says September 2021. I think it was August 31st. So we're close. But and then yeah, around October, making our partnership with CPW and EVLT official, essentially. Ever since then, we have kicked off various surveys, you know, to see what is at the site in terms of wildlife, ecological, botany, just all the type of kind of natural resource assets that we want to make sure we account for as we're planning things. We'll touch on more of the community working groups and public engagements that we've been doing over the last roughly year or so. We'll get to that more later. And all of this is building towards this coming spring, putting a draft concept of a plan, a proposed action, essentially, out there for public comment. And so that's why meetings like this are important. We want to hear from all of you, of your thoughts and input, hopes and dreams for the site. And then as this team here is building what that draft concept looks like, we put it out there for public comment. And that public comment, that kind of environmental analysis that I'm alluding to, that the Forest Service is looking to kick off, we call that NEPA. That's our National Environmental Policy Act. And so hoping to kind of formally, officially start that. Haven't set a set date other than targeting the spring, summer 2023 timeline. Next slide, please. So as I said, kind of ever since acquiring the land, we've been doing lots of sort of the data collection, assessing the facilities, doing a cultural analysis, seeing what we have out there. Last winter, we held a series of public meetings locally in Glenwood Springs and Gypsum to start gathering public input ever since it became public land. In October, we convened the Sweetwater Lake Working Group, which is a working group of the local community here to get information on those local priorities and the context and the history of the site for them, since they are going to be the community most impacted by what we decide on at the end of the road. Here we are in March at our public meeting, and we'll speak to survey opportunities later on today. And like I said, this is all leading to pretty soon now a spring, summer kickoff for our formal public comment environmental process. Next slide. And I'll boil down, this is like 4 weeks worth of a training to try and explain our NEPA process. But basically, the Forest Service is proposing to take a federal action on public lands. And that is what our proposal for a site development will be in and around Sweetwater. And we can't just do that. We have to do a public process that we call NEPA. And so this identify the purpose and need for action and develop the proposed actions. That's what I'm talking about in terms of we want to put together what our draft concept or concepts, we may have multiple, for the site is, and then put it out there for public comment. And that conduct scoping box, that is going to be, it's generally a 30-day public comment period. And that is where if you are interested in this project, even if you've participated in today's meeting, in any other meeting prior to this and provided input. If you still want your comments to be kind of formally counted in terms of having standing for later in our process, even if you participated before, still comment, and whether it's a letter of support or if you have, questions, comments, concerns about the proposal in that scoping period. And we'll be advertising and sharing very broadly when that will occur. Like I said, haven't set a specific date yet, but that's a key box kind of on this slide for everyone to be aware of today, is when we kick that off. That's sort of the formal start of our public process. So then from that, we'll get who knows how many comments regarding our proposal. Could be 5, could be 5,000, and we'll go through all of those. Some comments might not be relevant. Some might be, just really well-made comments of something that we hadn't considered before, or something that we may want to change or modify in our proposal. And so we'll make any modifications necessary. This conduct environmental analysis box is a little bit more for like internally for some of our specialists, like our botanists and our cultural specialists and wildlife specialists, et cetera, to make sure that what we're proposing at the site is also aligned with their resource areas. And then from that, we'll post sort of our draft of what we're going to be deciding on in an additional comment period. So it's a little different than our scoping period, but basically it's another opportunity for public comment. We consider those comments, and then the forest supervisor, my boss of the White River National Forest, is the decision maker for this proposal. And so he will sign a decision, and kind of from there, depending on how all those other steps go, there are additional objection time periods, could lead to litigation, depends on the project. Hopefully not this one, right? But those are steps as well that are kind of just much later. So for the purposes, I think, of most of you who are joining us today, those scoping and comment boxes are going to be most relevant to you, I would say, because that's that public engagement opportunity. I'll stop there. All right, and hand it off to Mark.
All right, so now we're going to delve into some of the efforts, many of which are ongoing, that will assist the partnership in making informed recommendations for the Sweetwater long-term plan to be then analyzed through the NEPA process, like Leanne explained. So for the 2022 season, Sweetwater is essentially operated by something of a skeleton staff. For the first time, as far as we know, 2 dedicated Forest Service employees were assigned up at Sweetwater that were funded by the Eagle Valley Land Trust. AJ Brink Outfitters also operated on site, providing her equestrian guiding services and boat rentals. And everyone is essentially working together to also provide some ongoing education to the visiting public on some of the changes to the Sweetwater property, as well as some of their opportunities to weigh in on the future of Sweetwater. Site being open for public access, by design, we didn't make any major changes or break any ground on any construction, because again, all of that's going to need to be assessed through the NEPA process. A couple things that did take place, EVLT purchased a boat ramp, which the partners then installed back in May to kind of enhance some of the access to the lake, and EVLT helped to fund just some of the ongoing operational costs for the Sweetwater property. Thanks, Melissa. So welcome to, we're talking about naming and designation of the site here, 2 different things. So the partners are working to establish a proposed name for the site. Best practices would have us consider the cultural heritage of the site, geographic attributes of the site, history of the site. Any proposed name that we come up with will then have to be vetted and approved through the Parks and Wildlife Commission. Additionally, the other side of this is the designation for the site. Colorado Parks and Wildlife manages on the park side of the house, state parks and state recreation areas. Each of those has statutory criteria that lend themselves to that definition. So We're still working on a name for the site as well as that designation. Thank you. So some of the, like I referenced, ongoing efforts to gather information to help us make informed decisions for the future of Sweetwater. Before the state was ever involved with this project, the Forest Service had been gathering biological data and cultural data through inventories of the site. And then back in summer and spring of 2022, CPW led some additional resource inventories, including, plants, so looking at native and invasive species, mammals, reptiles and amphibians, and then avian species present on the site. The Forest Service has been the active lead on the cultural inventories for the Sweetwater property. So all of that, again, will feed into something of a resource stewardship plan that will help to guide the long-term decision-making for the Sweetwater property. We also have our design firm who is helping gather some of the baseline site data and information, looking at existing utilities, what kind of development could the electric run to the property sustain, looking at the roadways, doing some traffic analysis on what's an appropriate level of traffic and vehicle size up and down the Sweetwater Road. It's a narrow, windy road that accesses this property, which Sweetwater is essentially the end of that road. Assessing water systems, doing some financial analysis. Again, just helping the partnership by providing information that will enable us to make good long-term decisions. As far as market analysis, they're looking at the demographics of the folks that would likely be visiting Sweetwater. So data tells us that the majority of people visiting the property will be coming from about 2 hours away. So we're looking at the demographics of those individuals, looking at recreational trends. As we all know, the population in Colorado is not shrinking. In fact, it is getting larger, and with that becomes a demand on our public lands. So we're trying to figure out what recreational activities to meet the visitors while still keeping in mind the past use and appropriate levels for use at Sweetwater. Recreational opportunities like hiking, equestrian use, camping, wildlife watching, and fishing. So again, all of this will feed into our long-term site design to be assessed through the NEPA process. Thank you. So as far as recreational uses on the site, like I mentioned, we want to consider recreational opportunities and densities as far as how much of what we want to provide that's appropriate for the scope of the Sweetwater property. We don't want to overdevelop it and destroy the experience of visiting Sweetwater. We also have to consider how adjacent public lands are managed. Adjacent to the Sweetwater property, there's a trailhead that within 2 miles, you're into the Flat Tops Wilderness. So that's going to factor into how we determine which recreational uses are vetted for this property. Additionally, the White River National Forest has a travel management plan that around the Sweetwater property would prohibit mountain biking and motorized use. So, Sweetwater is a jump off area for either of those activities may not make a lot of sense. Again, we don't necessarily want to make any huge changes to the site. We want to honor the previous usage while still considering how we can improve access and opportunity for the greater good of the recreating public. At this point, the Forest Service has some special orders in place to prevent new uses from occurring on the Sweetwater property until we have that long-term plan in place. And the partnerships missions will lend themselves to focus on these nature-based activities like hiking and equestrian use, camping, things like that. Thank you. So here we have a list of, it's not a final list, but of activities likely supported or likely not supported for Sweetwater. Again, when you consider the resources on site and the management of adjacent lands and the previous use of the site, you can kind of identify which uses are intuitive for the Sweetwater property. We have a history of equestrian use. There's phenomenal opportunities for horseback riding with Sweetwater as a jump off location, and we'd like to promote that kind of activity. We also know that we have a tremendous group of nesting raptors on the site. So activities like rock climbing and drone use may not be a good site to mitigate impact on the wildlife. You know, trailered watercraft, for example. You know, we talk about, we've heard loud and clear that people want the peaceful Sweetwater experience, and I don't know that that's facilitated by an environment dominated by the sound of gas motors. So just a lot of things to consider when we vet the list of appropriate recreational uses at Sweetwater. Thank you. So regardless of where we land on the long-term site designs, we can expect there's going to be change to how this property has been used in the past. We'll likely be inviting more people and providing different amenities, but the objective again is to identify something that's sustainable for the Sweetwater property. Both agencies, like I mentioned, want to provide sustainable outdoor recreation opportunities, but within that, there's a spectrum of what that could look like, as well as amenities that can both support those recreational opportunities and be sustained by those recreational opportunities, like food service, for example. All of this provides the opportunity for the public to weigh in on what their priorities look like, and that will be considered in you know, recommendations for the long-term site design. Thank you. So again, kind of reiterating a little bit, but you know, the objective here is to how to best meet you know, the growing demand for recreational opportunities in the area and in Colorado, while still addressing the desire to mitigate the impact on wildlife habitat, scenic viewing corridors, dark sky opportunities, and just the overall long-established character of the Sweetwater property. So all of these getting perspectives from different stakeholders help the partnership to really narrow things down. Okay. So this is a map showing obviously that Sweetwater Lake right there, and then what would be the permit boundary under CPW management. So within that area, I mean, we would look at disturbed locations that might be more appropriate for development, and more undisturbed areas that we would want to conserve for wildlife use, for wildlife habitat. So we have a lot of opportunities, even though, you know, Leanne mentioned the property acquisition was, you know, about 488 acres. All told, within this boundary here, we have just under 800 acres to work with for an ongoing plan for the long-term management of the site. Thank you. So currently we're throwing out some very draft preliminary site concepts. These are not by any means, you know, final drafts of what the Sweetwater property would look like. They're really just meant to facilitate discussion and conversation about what's possible on the site, what's appropriate for the site. Do we want it all condensed into one area, or do we want to spread out that use so that we're not having conflicts between user groups or just destroying the aesthetic? So these, again, are just tools for the partnership to use to kind of play with some different concept designs to be eventually fed into what would be that proposed action and vetted through the NEPA process. So at this point, we're considering, again, all those resource inventories, all the public input and community input that we've received up to date, while still knowing that we need to operate within the parameters of both the Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the U.S. Forest Service in a decision-making that's made. Like Melissa mentioned, there's going to be the link to the survey. Where I'd strongly encourage each of you to provide input, because you know, we want to hear it, and it's important that we create something out here that makes sense for the property and is going to be a benefit for those that want to visit Sweetwater. Thank you.
All right, I can jump in for the engagement piece. I think you're ready for the next slide. Again, I'm Bergen Josem. I'm from the Eagle Valley Land Trust. Right now, the best place to go to get information about Sweetwater Lake is evlt.org/Sweetwater. That's hosted on our EVLT website. We're working on doing a better job of getting more information out there, getting some updated frequently asked questions, resources about what's open, what's not open, the special orders, things like that. So if you go on there, you'll find a lot more information. We are also hosting a comment form. We've had up for about, I want to say about a year and a half at this point. And that is it's a simple comment form. And we want to hear from as many people as possible. Those comments are shared with the partnership and other key stakeholder groups. So it's a great way to let us know what some of your concerns are, what some of your thoughts are, ideas, things like that. So please do use that comment form on evlt.org/Sweetwater. And over the past about year and a half, the partnership has been diving into a variety of different community engagement opportunities in addition to that comment form. First of which has been community interviews that Melissa and CDR have undertaken, and they have been able to compile a lot of those sentiments from key local stakeholders to help guide the visioning process for that for the partnership. In addition to that, we hosted a handful of meetings. We hosted 3 meetings locally in person in early in 2022. So we hosted one of those in Glenwood Springs. We hosted one at Sweetwater, and then one in town of Gypsum. Really to start to understand what are some of the needs, what are some of the concerns that people have, and try to open that dialogue a little bit to try to figure out how best can we plan this, envision this so that it meets the needs of everybody, and we have some guidance going forward. So in addition to that, in late 2022, formed the Sweetwater Lake Working Group, which I'll get to on the next slides. I'm not going to go too much into that right now, but that's a kind of a local group that's helping us facilitate good conversations that are important about the future of that property and how it will impact the local community. There are also a lot of tribal resources on the site, and ultimately the partnership wants to have make sure that we have support from tribes going forward before any major decisions are made. The partnership has a lot of formal responsibilities to that regard, many of which are underway already and will continue to be underway. And then Melissa, I think, is going to drop it in the chat, but there will also be a more formal public survey, a little bit more guided public survey to get at some more specific feedback that we're looking for from people that are interested in contributing to the vision here. So that'll be on the site, and then keep an eye on evlt.org/Sweetwater as we update them. Again, we're looking for as much feedback as we can possibly get. And then I just wanted to reiterate, Leanne already touched on, during NEPA, there is a formal public comment period, and that is separate from this pre-NEPA comment form that we're hosting on evlt.org. So even if you have already submitted a comment to evlt.org, make sure that if you are interested in continuing to share your ideas and thoughts and concerns, that you comment formally during NEPA, because again, that gives you standing during that process. And I think Melissa just dropped the public survey in the chat there. So there are basically 3. There's the comment form, there's the public survey, and then there's the NEPA comment period, which will be coming soon. I think we're ready for the next slide. So to dive in a little bit more about the Sweetwater Lake Working Group, there are a lot of local advocates who live close to Sweetwater Lake who we recognize who will be disproportionately impacted by whatever happens at Sweetwater Lake, whatever that long-term vision looks like. And they have been engaged from the very beginning, and they have provided a lot of really important feedback, local concerns, and presented a lot of great opportunities for the site. So in late 2022, they formed a group of about 12, give or take, of really engaged folks that are helping to kind of open these lines of communication, increase transparency, and help us work through some very specific ideas, concepts on the site. So we meet every other week. I think we have a meeting coming up soon, and they're doing a good job of representing that Sweetwater community, relaying information and helping us all kind of ultimately when we get to a proposed action, we want to have a proposed action that meets the needs of the local community and also meets the needs of the partnership. I'm feeling confident that we're going in the right direction. Go to the next slide. I think this is Leanne.
Thank you. In addition, we've had strong county and municipal engagement. So just for some context, if you're not familiar with the area, the road to Sweetwater is actually in both Eagle and then transitions into Garfield County. And then Sweetwater Lake and vicinity itself is in Garfield County. Both counties have signed what we call cooperating agency agreements with the Forest Service, and that is for participating in kind of a closer way as part of our NEPA process, that environmental analysis. And both counties attend the Sweetwater Lake Working Group meetings. The town of Gypsum, we're currently also coordinating with them on if they're interested in having cooperating agency status as well. And town of Gypsum also participates in our various meetings and takes an interest.
And then going back to that public input conversation, we're looking for a lot of public input, and here are some of the big picture ideas that we really love to hear from our community, local, statewide, across the country. What are your thoughts around recreational uses at Sweetwater Lake, historical character, cultural resources, infrastructure, things like that? Again, we're looking for that information and those thoughts from you. So there are basically 3 different ways to make those comments: comment form at eblt.org, the public survey that'll come out soon, and then during NEPA. So we want to hear your feedback. And to date so far, CDR and Melissa have done a really good job of compiling a lot of what we heard from all these different outlets and from stakeholder interviews into a variety of different themes that we hear over and over and over again. And they've helped guide the partnership to pointing it in the right direction of what seems feasible based on what our community sees up there. So big picture view is, it's first of all, it's protect and enhance that natural landscape and that wildlife habitat. It is honoring the history and the legacy, which is, there are people up there who have lived there for a long time, many, many generations. And there's a lot of history on that site, including a tremendous amount of Ute history. So it's protecting that and for the long term. Also improving some of the amenities and services, making it accessible to people. It's a long way from town. It's a long way from the Front Range. Making sure that it is accessible to all people and there's an equity component there as well. To local community and much of Eagle County and Garfield County, it served as a community gathering space, and there's been food service opportunities there for a long time. And the community is very interested in keeping that going. So that's another piece of information that we've heard a lot. Another very common theme is manage that visitation so it's not completely overrun. We know, especially during COVID in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of our public lands get loved to death. We see a lot of use, and it's hard to manage that use. So really focusing on how do we create sustainable recreation up there and sustainable visitation where it's controlled and it doesn't ruin all the things that we all love so much about Sweetwater. And another major thing that we've heard is make sure that there is outfitter services there. And AJ Brink Outfitters has been there for so long, providing this incredible experience to everybody, being able to ride horses and enjoy that lake in a really classic way that it's been for decades. So making sure that we can continue that is an important piece of feedback we've heard.
Awesome. Thanks, Bergen, Mark, and Leanne, for your overview of where we're at with the project. Just a quick kind of opportunities to stay involved. We've mentioned these already, so I don't want to belabor the point, but the public survey, we just opened it today. So that is now, the links are in your chat, and you can access those. And encourage you all to give your input. We have an English version, and then if you would prefer to respond in Spanish, we will have that Spanish version is open as well. And then a plug for that NEPA process to be kind of on the lookout for the spring, summer 2023 kickoff to the NEPA process and the opportunity for comments. And I know we've got a couple questions about that in the chat, so we'll be sure to answer those as we go through the Q&A. I will encourage folks, as we go through this question and answer period, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I'm capturing them. We're going to try to get through as many as possible. And I did see a question about the recording. So the recording will be up on EVLT's website. It'll takes for recording this long, a little bit of time to download, but we'll try to get that up as soon as possible, so folks who were not able to attend can go to the website and get more information, and then also respond to the survey questions. With that, I'm going to start with a couple questions that we've had. We've gotten a few different ones in different formats, but the same, really kind of the same question. Mark had mentioned that the site, originally the site was purchased at 488 acres. Now they're looking at a approximately 800 acre area of this project. So Leanne, I might turn that over to you to talk about how the change happened and kind of what's behind that.
Great. Yeah, great question. So the 488 acres, that's the private land that the Forest Service acquired, that became National Forest public land. And so then when we looked at the whole area of like, okay, what makes sense to manage, for example, we had the Forest Service campground on the south side of the lake. So we add that into, I'll call it the management unit. There's a Forest Service guard station a little to the east that would be included in the management area. The trail, we included the trails along the south side and wrapped it around. Sorry, we're not looking at the site right now, so I'll just, we included the trails along the south side, wrapped it around the cliff band to include the west wetlands up to the head gate of the keep ditch. So basically drew a boundary around what is a manageable area. I mean, it'd be odd to not include the Forest Service campground, for example, at the south side of the lake, because it's right there, and like, why wouldn't you include that? So, so we added certain areas of already existing public land that were in the vicinity around the private that we acquired, and it comes to about 800.
Great, thanks so much, Leanne. And I'm going to stop sharing so folks can see all of the different panelists, but if I need to pull up a specific slide, just let me know during the Q&A. Okay, so next question. Mark, you had also mentioned the conversation about the site's name. So we've gotten a few comments and also some questions about the site naming. Could you explain that process a little bit? In specific, the question is why the site needs a different name. I don't know that that's necessarily the assumption, but yeah, I want to turn it to you to address that question.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that the site needs a different name. Sweetwater Lake seems pretty intuitive. It makes sense, but we just want to articulate that we want it to be a thoughtful process in considering alternatives before going to the Parks and Wildlife Commission with a proposal.
Great. Any other panelists have anything to add to that? Okay. A few questions about NEPA have come in. So Leanne, you mentioned a little bit about standing. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about what does it mean to have standing in the NEPA process, and how does that work?
Yep. So, and if other Forest Service people, if I bungle this, please step in. But basically, standing is your legal, I can't think of another word, but standing. Let me explain this a little differently. Basically, if you don't comment on this project during the scoping period, kind of during the formal just time frame of when we go public with this, and then you decide, you know, a year and a half from now, I don't like this project, I want to, you know, I want to litigate, or I want to stop it, or whatever, because you didn't participate in sort of those scoping period and the comment period, kind of legally, in terms of being able to litigate and have standing in like a court, essentially, you would not qualify. And so that's why, even if you're providing comments today and you've been talking with us for months and you know, previously, and you attended a public meeting a year ago, if you want to kind of continue to be involved in the process and have that legal standing, I mean, that legal access to continue to participate, whether you know, you don't like the project and you want to object, or whatever your reason is, we need you to submit your comments and participate during that NEPA process. And I saw a question out there, like, how will we know when all of this is? I feel like it's probably going to be hard to miss with the amount of media interest, news releases, the number of people who have joined today. I mean, we'll be blasting out the notice far and wide. CPW, EVLT, everyone will, I assume, will probably email everyone who attended today when that will be. So I think it'll be hopefully very obvious when that time has come.
And there's a requirement, Leanne, to post it in specific papers and kind of news sources as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we're also required. We post a notice in the Federal Register, and the White Rivers newspaper of record for that is the Glenwood Post-Independent. We'll also put it in the Vale Daily, and then kind of from there, I mean, I sort of presume that other media outlets will post as well. Awesome.
Thanks, Leanne. There's a couple folks asked about attendees. So we've got about a little over 100 attendees today. And so that's a really great turnout. We're really excited to see that. We're also going to post this, like I mentioned, on the website. So we know that maybe this time wasn't great for everyone. And so we'll have this recording posted live on the website so people can access it after the fact as well. So moving on to a couple questions that we're getting in about recreation. And I'm actually not sure who the best person is to answer this question. So I may just kind of open it up to our panelists. And I don't know if it's Leanne or maybe Paula or Mark. What about private operations and potential reservation systems? So the question specifically is there a possibility of a private contractor operating Sweetwater similar to Trappers, if folks are familiar, and a comment about potentially using that as an opportunity to control numbers and potentially being overrun. So curious, Leanne or Mark, if either of you want to tag team it and then maybe pull in anyone else.
I could do the private contractor one. If maybe Mark, you could do the reservation one, or yeah, we could figure that out. So for the private operation, so let's assume for a minute that the Forest Service, we're not partnering with CPW right now, even though we totally are, but let's assume we're not. What the Forest Service would need to do in order to have a private business kind of operate the site, we can't just pick one and say, here you go, here's all this federal land for you to generate revenue on. We would have to issue a competitive prospectus. And so then companies, businesses, whatever term you want to use, could basically apply to be the site concessionaire. And there's a lot of kind of specific steps and rules and everything that we, the Forest Service, have to follow to do that. But basically anyone could apply. A local operator who's been there for decades, a multi-million-dollar corporation who runs national park sites all over the country, who wants to diversify. I mean, you never know who you can get. So that would be for a long-term permit to a private entity, that would be the process we would have to kickoff, whereas working with CPW is different due to them being a state entity. In terms of the reservation system, I might not be the best on that one. I can certainly try, but I don't know if Mark, you wanted to give that one
Sure.
go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's a great question, and you know, reservation systems are an excellent way of controlling how many people visit a site. CPW almost exclusively operates campgrounds on a reservation system anymore. I know times have changed from the days of just packing the family up and all your camping gear heading into the mountains for a impromptu visit. Now you pretty much have to plan ahead if you want a spot. And so that's for camping or overnight use. We're seeing, you know, like Bergen mentioned, this uptick in use over the last few years where a lot of public lands, you know, a lot of national parks are going to a timed entry system or a day use reservation system. That's something that we could consider as one way to mitigate the volume of people visiting Sweetwater and the amount of traffic on the Sweetwater Road. You know, it's probably, if we were to consider it, it'd be something where we're targeting some of those high use areas like weekends and holidays. It wouldn't have to be 7 days a week, all day. It's also something that we could, you know, employ an adaptive management strategy to see what kind of visitation we're getting and implement systems like that to control it. But it's definitely something we've considered because we've heard loud and clear that there's a lot of concern about overrunning the site. And there's some concern because, you know, you lose cell signal about 45 minutes from Sweetwater Lake. And what we don't want is people leaving I-70, for example, at the Dotsero exit, getting all the way up Sweetwater only to find out that they don't have a spot to park. And now they're hauling back down the Sweetwater Road or parking along the county road and walking into the site. So definitely considerations in the long-term management.
Thanks, Mark. And just while we're on the recreation discussion, we had a question about RVs and whether RVs will be allowed at the site. Could you talk about kind of the planning process and where we are in that decision making? And I don't know if maybe others want to chime in on that too.
Sure. You know, we've heard we've got some input that, you know, people don't want to see large RVs on the site. We've heard that we don't want electrical campsites at Sweetwater because that promotes the use of RVs. We've also heard we don't want generators on the site. But I think we have to consider framing these as trade-off. You know, if you have, for example, electrical amenities in a campsite, then you have no need for generators. You know, you plug your camper trailer or small RV or whatever into the campsite, and then you don't need to run a generator. I think it would be pretty problematic to say that, you know, we're not going to provide electrical services and expect that people won't want to turn generators on. So keep in mind, no decisions have been made. These are just some of the conversations we have as far as trade-offs go.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Okay. We have a question on water rights, and I think I see some discussion. I'll read the question, and then Leanne and maybe Rich, who's also here from the Forest Service, can try to answer. If we don't have the right answer, we can always get back to folks on the answer. So let me see if I can. So is there information on the future uses of the water rights acquired? So in my understanding, and I hope I'm not quoting wrong, some of the water rights are still held by the Conservation Trust organization. Oh, and I see Jacob, you have your hand up. And potentially there's a question of whether they'll be sold elsewhere. So maybe Jacob, since you've got your hand up, do you want to take this question and introduce yourself too while you're at it?
Sure. My name is Jacob Ray. I'm a Deputy Region Manager for the Northwest Region of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. You're correct. The Conservation Fund acquired more water rights with the acquisition than the Forest Service thought that they could put to beneficial use on the property. So there's a balance of rights that the Conservation Fund still holds, and they're looking to not hold on to those forever, not to sell those They're looking to convey those to a conservation-minded organization that may be able to benefit from those.
Great, thanks, Jacob. Anyone else want to add to that?
This is Rich Doak. I'm sorry, I can't get my camera going right now. No, Jacob hit it perfectly. That's the Forest Service acquired only what we felt we could use on the site with a reasonable level of development. There were surplus water rights, and Jacob described it perfectly. Melissa?
Great, thanks to both of you. Okay, so continuing with the recreation theme, and I'm trying to get to everyone's questions, and I see a lot coming in, so I'm trying to keep them organized, so bear with me. So one question, again, we've got some comments about generators, but then also about equestrian use. And so the equestrian use is something we've heard a lot about from the local community, and curious if Mark, Leanne, Bergen, any of you can speak to accommodating equestrian users and their different needs. And I do know this is a survey question, so I'll just give another plug for the survey while other folks are coming off mute.
Yeah, I can take an initial, yes, we're definitely considering, you know, where number of equestrian campsites, where might they best be located? You know, thinking about the flow at the site of, you know, horse camps over here, maybe tent campers kind of in a different section. I mean, all that thinking of just looking at the site there and where everything can fit, that's definitely comes up all the time for where the equestrian use can be situated. And like we've said before, you know, that's part of the historical use of the area. So I would certainly expect to see that in a proposed action. And that would be a great one to comment on when we do so, whether you want to see more or less of it with whatever we come up with. Maybe we're going to propose 10 sites and you want to see 50. I mean, we want to hear your thoughts. So anyone want to add to that? But yes, we're definitely considering it.
Great, thanks, Leanne. Another recreation consideration. So Mark, you had mentioned hand-launched watercraft, which is a tongue twister. Will there be a maximum number, an anticipated amount? Where are we at in the planning process around that question?
So preliminarily, I mean, we entertained a carrying capacity on Sweetwater Lake. I mean, the lake itself is 72 acres at the third largest natural lake in Colorado, still kind of a pond, really. And so, yeah, you couldn't sustain a tremendous amount of use up there. I think trying to control the amount of, paddlecraft or watercraft on the lake surface could be tricky, but where we could potentially, affect some control in that way is just the amount of parking that we have up there. You know, if you don't have 150 parking spaces, then that's going to limit the amount of people bringing toys up there to go play around on the water with. Lake access, for example, that's another way that if it's not meant to sustain a tremendous amount of use, then that's going to have a direct impact on what kind of use we could expect to see.
Great, thanks, Mark. What about, and I think maybe Leanne, you touched on this, but I just want to make sure it's clear. There's a question about the adjacent Sweetwater campground and that being incorporated into the Sweetwater area. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the campground at kind of the south side of the lake there, it's got 9 spaces. It's an all right campground. Now that we have kind of this whole area to look at and plan out what might be possible, don't be surprised to see, maybe that becomes a day use area. I mean, the sites are smaller, the parking's a little, so that's been part of our conversation of, okay, if we're going to end up with camping areas elsewhere, there's also going to be a day use need at the lake. maybe that's a good spot for it. So if that is what comes out in our proposed action when we go to the public comment process, and if you love the idea, tell us. If you hate it and say, no, we really want that to stay the campground, we want to hear that too. I can't promise that based on your comment, we would keep it a campground or do day use or, you know, whatever your comment is. But yes, that area, we are looking at it, but trying to think more holistically now with the rest of the area, what makes sense on that south side. Is it a campground or something else?
Great. Thanks, Leanne. I'm going to pivot to, and I know we've got a few recreation questions. I'm going to come back to them. I want to make sure we touch on a few other subjects during the Q&A. So one is about wildlife. So Mark, you had mentioned, and want to bring you in as well as Jacob, if you have any thoughts on this. Given the presence of several state wildlife action plan plants and animal species, Mark, you mentioned a few of those that occupy the area. What are considerations for recreation closures to protect these plants and animals? How is the planning process considering these important resources as part of the discussion?
It's very heavily factored into the conversations that we have. I've seen some concern about, you know, the property boundary growing, and just keep in mind that whether it's 488 acres or 800 acres, generally speaking, we'd like to avoid undeveloped or undisturbed areas. And those are areas that are going to be prime to be maintained and conserved for wildlife habitat or to protect sensitive plant species. We're still waiting on some of the finalized reports of what species of plants and animals are on the site, but we will absolutely plan around those things to make sure that we're mitigating as much impact as possible. I mean, you consider like the wetland area up there, you know, if we can stay out of that altogether, maybe that's a win, and provide that habitat unimpacted. We want to stay away from raptor areas to a reasonable extent. We've considered, you know, seasonal closures to mitigate impact for elk for their, you know, the severe winter range areas that overlap with the property. So it's, you know, again, like I mentioned before, it's taking all these resource inventories. It's not just a list of what occurs on the site, but what and where, and incorporating that into the planning process.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. What about in similar kind of thinking about some of the different site amenities? We've talked a little bit about wildlife, a little bit about recreation. We have some questions in the chat about some of the buildings and the current infrastructure that's there, in particular, some of the kind of Western heritage and character that those buildings embody. And so are there plans to upgrade or renovate those cabins, or will they remain, or what will happen to them?
I could start off on that one. I would say, as of right now, no final decisions made on the buildings and such, but I don't know that a plan to renovate or keep the existing buildings will be kind of what we go with or what we propose for public comment. There's a lot of comments about how they're historical, et cetera. The Forest Service consults with the State Historic Preservation Office as part of our required kind of cultural consultation. And by their definition of what's historic and contributing and having those characteristics and such, none of the buildings are eligible to be historic on their own. So while, yes, they are historic in that they've been there a while and they kind of contribute to that history on the site, they are not historic per se. With that said, from the Forest Service's standpoint, you know, our regional office engineering staff did kind of a full assessment after we acquired the property, did a full assessment of all of the buildings, and they're essentially teetering on, or if not there for some of them, at a condemned status. So to invest and put money into renovating the existing buildings, it's pretty serious question we need to ask ourselves as the stewards of taxpayer dollars and you know, the revenue on the site, et cetera. Is that the best use of funds, or is building new with a historic kind of look, you know, with that more like older kind of feel? You know, there's all types of roof designs and just architectural layouts and everything that you can do for structures now that make them look like they're of a certain era. So we haven't, you know, finalized kind of those conversations. There are ones that we're having. I think we have a lot of options out there, but given the current state of the buildings that are out there now, I can't say yes that we would keep and renovate what's there. Anyone want to add to that?
I'll just add a comment to it. Just real quick. We know that the buildings up there, there's a lot of emotional tie to them, and they have been a big part of AJ Brink Outfitters' operation over the years. Got to consider the reality is that they are just in pretty abhorrent shape right now. It's just been very minimal upkeep on these buildings over the years, and today, like Leanne said, it's just, it would require substantial investment to bring them up to any kind of a standard where I think, you know, ADA accessibility or public occupancy would really be considered for them.
Rich, did you have something to add?
Mark covered it. I will add to Leanne's a little bit. One of the things that we will ultimately do up there is do an interpretive plan for the site. And that will, because one of the things you've heard over and over talked about is we do want the public to understand what took place on this site, both through the 8,000 years that the Utes were there, as well as the last 100 or so years of more modern history. And so once we do an interpretive plan, there may be some possibilities of figuring out good ways to let the public know what took place on the site without, as Leanne kind of mentioned, having to retain everything that's on the site. So I think for those who want to comment, and I saw in the chat, there's a specific building or two someone mentioned, and the importance and the background behind it. That's the important information to be getting to this group now, so that we can do those evaluations as we move along.
Great, thanks so much, Rich. Keeping in the resources theme, a natural resource that we've heard about are the dark skies. And so I know there's been some discussion and we received some input when we did our interviews about the dark skies at Sweetwater. We had a photo in the presentation highlighting that as well. Mark, could you talk about the, and others feel free to chime in, about the process to protect the dark skies at Sweetwater in the surrounding area?
To the best of my ability. This is something that I'd say the partnership is very supportive of. There just aren't many places you can go in the US anymore and experience like true dark skies. And we've got the opportunity here, especially with any new construction, to incorporate design elements into these buildings that would promote that dark sky opportunity at Sweetwater. It's another piece of the puzzle and something that we haven't really discussed in any great depth, but you know, can't speak for everyone, but I think that's something that, you know, it seems like essentially a no-brainer to entertain dark skies for Sweetwater.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. Any other partners want to add on to that? Okay, perfect. I'm going to transition us. We've received a few questions about the public input portion and the local community's involvement. And first, Bergen, I know that Leanne kind of briefly mentioned the Save the Lake campaign. Could you give just a quick history of what that campaign was, the goals of that campaign, and yeah, just some background information on that for everyone?
Certainly. So it was about middle of 2019 when our previous executive director, Jim Dawes, started working with Justin at the Conservation Fund, saw that the property was for sale by the development group that had owned it for, I want to say, close to 10 years. They were about to put it up for sale. And so EVLT and the Conservation Fund, along with many local volunteers and a group really dedicated to that property, came together to launch the Save the Lake campaign, which ultimately was, the goal of which was to raise money to support the Conservation Fund's acquisition of that property, and help offset the cost of transferring that to the Forest Service. I think conveying it is maybe the right word. The reason that kind of went that direction was because the Land and Water Conservation Fund is an allocation by Congress that allocates money to national forests across the country to be able to acquire new properties. Really promising avenue for protecting this big piece of property, which is pretty expensive, that no real entity could do alone. So ultimately, the campaign, with the help of Eagle County and the town of Gypsum, town of Eagle, and I think about at least 100 local donors, raised enough money for the Conservation Fund to feel confident to purchase that property in 2020. That also, a loan from Great Outdoors Colorado helped lower that holding cost a little bit for them, so that the Forest Service had time to apply for that Land and Water Conservation Fund funding, which they received in more than expected. So it ended up being a pretty remarkable success in terms of an acquisition project, which are, success and acquisition projects are hard to come by. So that property was ultimately, the Conservation Fund was able to convey it to the Forest Service, and that's kind of where that's kind of how Forest Service came into ownership of that property.
Thanks, Bergen. Leanne, anything to add on the history piece? I know you covered that in your slides, but
no, that was great.
Perfect. So a couple questions came in, recognizing that there are a couple property owners that border the property itself. Just curious if anyone can speak to kind of engagement with those property owners, what that looks like, and then if they can anticipate how they'll be affected as part of what to expect as part of what's next for the Sweetwater property.
I can take a first stab at that one. First off, definitely comment in the NEPA process for sure. You're important stakeholders here. I guess I like to try and think about the alternative of, okay, let's say this is not a managed site with a park manager and staff available to, control parking, to make sure that the trash is collected, that the campground isn't getting rowdy at night, like all of the things that can happen on public land when there's no one there to try and manage the public, dogs running around. Who knows what might be there. So I'll just say from the Forest Service perspective, without this CPW partnership, I maybe alluded to it too briefly earlier, I don't have staff or funding to manage for that. And I feel like I'm one Instagram post away from, who knows? Hanging Lake is not a state park. Maroon Bells, Quandary Peak. The list goes on of places in Colorado that we need to figure out a management plan for. And so for those adjacent landowners of what you can expect, I think you could expect a best case scenario of this partnership with CPW, because I can't give any promises of what the alternative looks like if it's just the Forest Service managing the site. I'll pivot to Rich. I see your hand is up.
I'm just going to add a little bit to that, Leanne, on the outreach and involvement side. The private landowners, they were some of them that we sent some of the very first letters when we were planning on purchasing the site for the Forest Service, and got them involved in their input at that. With any process, some folks choose to be more involved than others, but we will continue the outreach and involvement with the folks as they desire as this process moves forward. But even if they aren't commenting, I think Leanne started down the road of we're trying to do the best we can in the planning to consider that is a private property, both on the east and west end, and how what we're doing on the site may affect that. In some of the site planning, we're looking at maybe ways of reducing some of their impacts. So we'll continue working on that type of thing.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, and apologies to the landowners if I didn't fully understand the question. But it's things like rerouting a trail to be further away from private property could be an option, and et cetera, to Rich's better point. Thanks.
Thanks to you both. Appreciate it. So looking at my question list, I'm just going to make sure I'm making the right pivot here. So could the question is, and I maybe will take an initial shot at it and see if any of the other partners want to add to this. So there's a question about, could you please give us an idea of some of the key issues and conversation at the Sweetwater Lake Working Group meetings? And so these conversations are really intended to understand local input into the site. We've heard a lot about the preservation of Sweetwater. Bergen mentioned a few bullet points about the historical component, the value of what has historically happened at Sweetwater, the outfitting services, the different recreation opportunities, the importance of equestrian use being one of those as well. So what we're trying to do as part of those Sweetwater Lake Working Group meetings is really understand those questions and those issues and consider them as part of the planning process. So, you know, my role is to facilitate the conversations and to help bring those perspectives out, while CPW and the Forest Service are really just looking at are in that listening mode of trying to understand what those different perspectives are. I think Bergen covered it on a few slides, but I don't know if others who have been involved, we've had EVLT, the Forest Service, and CPW attending all of those meetings to make sure that those voices are heard and raised as part of the planning process. Anything more to add from any of the folks who have been attending those meetings from the planning team?
I might add that I think I mentioned it before, but the comment form on evlt.org/Sweetwater, anytime we get new comments into that comment form, we'll share that with that group so they can see kind of what the conversation is outside of the local community or inside from wherever those comments come from. So that's an additional piece of information that's considered in that stakeholder group.
Great point. Thanks, Bergen. Okay. Pivoting now to a few questions that we've received on infrastructure. So we talked a little bit about the buildings themselves, but what about infrastructure improvements? So what infrastructure improvements were required if infrastructure improvements were required to access Sweetwater Lake, who would manage that process and how would it be funded? So thinking about the process piece, I might, Leanne, ask you if you have thoughts, and then maybe some CPW folks as well. So the question again, if there's infrastructure improvements, how is that process managed and how is it funded?
Okay, yes. So, well, first off, any infrastructure improvements, new buildings, new campground, whatever it is, that's all what's going to go through NEPA to get approved. And undergo kind of that analysis. And then in terms of implementing it, that's where our partnership with CPW and EVLT, I mean, for the purpose of this question, our partnership with CPW comes in then in terms of something I'll also touch on is when we're putting together a kind of our proposed action for this NEPA process, we may also break it down into different phases. So just to make the math easy, let's say it's a 20 site campground, tent campground, and 10 horse campsites, 10 cabins. You know, phase 1 could be like 10 of one, 5 of one, 5 of the other. And then phase 2, 5 years down the road, you know, we want to build out the rest, or whatever kind of makes sense. And so then the funding piece is where this partnership between the Forest Service and CPW comes into play of, yeah, what is the funding source at that time? You know, lining up the contractors and just the work to take place. Any Jacob or Mark want to add to that?
I guess I would just add that it's about the opportunities that we have here, the opportunity to work together, you know, bringing some of those funding sources together. And it really goes back to the opportunity to provide more. This place is special to the local community and to several people that have been there for reasons. And we want others to experience that as well. I know they do also, just in a respectful manner. As far as the funding piece goes, it gets complicated as far as who does what and where money comes from. But again, I think that's one of the benefits of the partnership, is that you have these groups working together in the best interests of the land and the community, and that's a piece that we want to respect.
And it looks like there's a bit of clarifying in the chat on that question, referring to the roadways and access, which I think is maybe a different conversation in itself, but also a great question around the roadways and access, how that may change as part of what's going to happen at Sweetwater. So I don't know who wants to chime in on that one.
I can take a stab at it. You know, I mentioned that our subcontracted design firm is looking at you know, capacity of the roadway and vehicle dimensions that are a good fit. How we would impact traffic on a Sweetwater road is in the volume and amenities that we provide at the site. You know, if we built this place out in every square inch of developable area, clearly that's going to equate to a tremendous amount of traffic on the road. That's not the partnership's intent here. So yeah, I mean, we consider the amount of parking spaces and dimensions for campsites. You know, maybe they don't accommodate the biggest Class A RVs that are out there because that's not an appropriate vehicle, or may not be an appropriate vehicle for the Sweetwater road. So I think considering some of those design elements and how that impacts access to the property up and down the Sweetwater Road and the Colorado River Road below it, that's how we would look at addressing it. Hopefully that provides a little more insight.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. I'm going to end. I know we're just at at 7:30. We're going to try to, you know, as I said, we'll have a recording of this. If there are any major questions that don't get answered, what I would encourage folks to do is to make sure that you take that survey, provide your questions in that survey as well, and we'll try to get responses to those. One final question, Leanne, this is for you about the NEPA process. What level of NEPA analysis will be conducted? Has that been decided yet?
Hasn't been decided yet, based on our experience with sort of prior projects of this scope and size, and just looking at there's kind of these different categories that we choose from for what level to do NEPA. We are anticipating that this will be an environmental assessment, or an EA. And then from like our scoping and as we go through the process, if circumstances are brought to our attention that would mean this needs to be elevated to an even higher level of analysis for whatever various reasons, then at that point it would be elevated to an environmental impact statement or an EIS. But at least for right now, we're anticipating an EA. And if that's gibberish to folks who don't understand the difference between those two. It's essentially different levels of documentation, different levels of providing for mitigation for the effects of or actions on public land. Yeah, it's kind of a, I don't know. That's the best I could do, I think, with that analysis or with that explanation. It's sort of a, yeah, just additional level of kind of analyzing for alternatives and such. But under an environmental assessment level, we are still going to have alternatives to analyze for, and pretty much everything you would expect to get with a project like this.
Great, thanks, Leanne. And I also want to remind folks, there is a webinar on NEPA on the EVLT website, so evlt.org/Sweetwater. So you can go to there, learn a little bit more about the NEPA process. There's also a lot of resources online, but that webinar was targeted towards this project, so you can learn a little bit more about what that means.
And that one's from our NEPA expert, not me, our actual NEPA planner.
Exactly. Bergen, thanks, commented towards me in the chat that we're going to update those FAQs. So if you go to evlt.org/Sweetwater, you'll see that there are FAQs, so frequently asked questions on the website. We'll update those as a response to this meeting. So if you didn't see your question answered here, encourage you all to check back at that site so that you can kind of see some of those ongoing updates as we go. I'm going to post, just to round us out, the survey links in the chat one last time. Encourage you all to fill out the survey, also share it with your neighbors and your community members, organizations that you're with. We want to get as much input as we can over the next few weeks as the survey opportunity is open. So that'll be open for about 3 weeks. And with that, I just want to say a huge thank you. I don't know if any of our panelists have any closing words, but really appreciate the great questions. I know we didn't get through everything, but I think there was a great discussion on recreation, natural resources, infrastructure, community. And so I just appreciate everyone sticking with it and all of your great questions. So Bergen, Leanne, Mark, any final words?
Thank you for everyone's time, for taking your Monday night to be with us, and looking forward to hearing from you all, hopefully, as this process continues.
Yeah, and just thank you all for your energy since the very beginning, since 2019. A ton of people came out and to support this project from the very, very beginning, and that's the reason we're here today. We appreciate all your feedback that you provided thus far, but don't stop now. Keep it coming. You know, we have a lot of big decisions to make, and there is a lot of opportunity for feedback. So please do keep it coming. We are listening.
Yeah, just to echo, thanks everyone for the effort, and please fill out that survey. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Thank you.